Much is being made of American humor today, the trend of humorists, and much nonsense is being said these days, too. And, of course, the name of one comes to mind immediately, Mort Sahl, who is, if nothing else, certainly provocative. Sahl's territory is not the usual one of, he's not a creature of gag men. The mother-in-law jokes, the divorce jokes, or the TV personality jokes may be part, now and then, if he does use them, they're integrated as part of something. He comments on the scene. Mort, often you're asked the question. Mort Sahl is our guest this morning. And often the question is asked of Mort Sahl, I know, one that he tires of much, I'm sure. You represent a new kind of humorist, and the misused phrase sick is used here. It's much of a cliche now as the word beat. What's your feeling when you're told you're a new kind of humorist?
Well, you know, Studs, first of all, if I represent a new kind, where are the others? Let's get back to that. You know, if it's a new trend, I'm pretty lonely for a guy who's part of a movement. I just came back from Cuba. And when I was there, I saw people who actually found a form of escape in sublimating to a greater cause. In this country, all we know is subjectivity. So they know what it is not to be lonely. However, there's nothing new about this. It's an American tradition, and it's a pretty sad commentary on our time that anyone who pursues a traditional role is considered radical. You know, I mean, from the norm. So it's traditional. My God, Mark Twain was doing it a long time ago. And better.
Well, since you brought up Mark Twain, it seems there's an old tradition in which the true humorist, and certainly you're in that category, chooses targets that are not clay pigeons. That is, the more formidable the target, it seems, the more lasting the humor. Twain, writing of Huck in a slave society, really ripped the pants off slavery at the time through his boy Huck. Mr. Dooley, at the time of the McKinley administration, was ripping the heck out of expansion at the time.
Well, you know, Studs, one of the ironies of our time, and I say this at the risk of sounding pedantic, and I don't want to become too scholarly, but I go into this at this depth because I'm in a role of justifying myself perpetually. One of the ironies is that you can go on the stage and be generally cynical about the entire human condition and not even entertain hope for our future as human beings, and you'll be considered a good, wholesome, all-around red-blooded comedian. If you are specifically cynical about institutions that aren't worthy, you're then called sick and negative. And it's always interesting, if you accuse anyone of cynicism, they always say, I'm being realistic. One word can, you know, it's a conditioned response. But that's one of the ironies, is that if you're at this extreme, I want to point out, you know, people go from, you see people, for instance, I was just on the coast, and gag writers who work in television, which they consider mass media, and are turning out saccharine family comedy, had a stag dinner. When they went to the stag dinner, they all became profane. That was their degree of release. I mean, they didn't tell the truth, but their reaction against years of oppression is to degrade themselves rather than those who oppressed them. So it means they went from a saccharine ignoring of the facts to the other extreme of obscenity, but they never once came in contact with the truth. It's just sort of a magnetic polarity.
An interesting comment you're making here, this is to me a very telling one, that when a comic, so-called, whether he's a creature of his writers or whether stuff is original, is cynical all the way, and almost, and if his gags are somewhat sadistic too, he's quite all right, it's accepted. But as in your case, when you pinpoint certain false values, you're called, you put in the category of sick, quote unquote.
Then you're negative. See, in other words, it's the same thing. A guy gets up and wastes your time for half an hour. A comedian, he talks about his mother-in-law, and he gives you all these fictitious situations. His wife makes him mow the lawn when he would rather be getting a cat nap, and all these false situations in living. And he is not. Then, if anyone comes along and says something of any content, he says they have a message. He has a message too. Anybody who opens his mouth has a message. It's just that some messages are worthy than more worthy than others, I would think.
I'm thinking of this phrase, the phrase sick, and I start thinking, you know, a lunatic sometimes always thinks other people are nuts, you know. Isn't that so? And
yes,
so
he does.
People who use the phrase sick about a certain humor that's pungent, apparently their own values are the ones that are challenged, so we must suspect their values are somewhat sick.
Well, of course, you know, that goes back to any kind of smear. People start categorizing. they stratify where there's no category, which is unfortunate. But I've never. There's a different humor. There's a difference between sick humor and social commentary. And social commentary, one performer will open the doors of a church to expose what he thinks is exploitation of the people's faith, and another guy will open the doors merely to paint a mustache on a Madonna, because that's how he gets his kicks.
I think that people would like to know, Mort, if not trade secrets, but your approach as a humorist. We speak of your newspaper. How do you, without giving away trade secrets, is there an approach you use, say, each evening?
Oh, sure. It's I'll tell anything I know. I'm ignorant in a lot of these areas, too. It's just a synthesis. I read as many papers as I can get my hands on because of a basic curiosity, not because I'm well-disciplined in my work by any means. And then the jokes grow from night to night. It's liable to be anything, but it starts... I'll tell you the way an area will grow, just as an example. Now, it started initially with perhaps one Republican candidate says that Jack Kennedy is a Catholic, and so the joke will grow. In other words, he comes out and he says, why doesn't Kennedy take a stand on birth control? So I said to the audience, Kennedy has not taken a stand on birth control, but I think there are more important issues than birth control facing us. So that got, really nothing. But then that grew from night to night to a point where, in 3 weeks, it had become this well organized, oddly enough. It mushroomed to, I see that one candidate said that Jack Kennedy is a Catholic, and he read other bulletins through the evening. Then he said, let's face the fact that being a Catholic will condition Kennedy's behavior. And then I pointed out to the audience that wasn't necessarily true, because Vice President Nixon is a Quaker, and it hasn't conditioned his necessarily. And then we go from that to the point that someone comes up to me and says, what do you think about birth control? I say, I don't think about that at all. I'm thinking about disarmament most of the time as a major issue. And then I point out that maybe ignoring the issue of birth control is a traditional role with men, so we can't relate that politically. And then if that doesn't go anywhere, I take a further avenue. You see, it goes a million ways. That I'm thinking about disarmament. And when I'm thinking about the hydrogen bomb, and a girl comes up to me and says, do you think a Catholic can be president? And I say, oh, sure, if we're here. And then then we're off with the hydrogen bomb, and then I finally wind it up with Kennedy saying, please accept me as a senator, not on a basis of my faith. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, the hereafter is taken care of, but November is driving me out of my mind. And it just goes on like that. You can just go.
So there's one basic idea, and from this you expand, and sometimes the news of the day, of the following day, may lead to that.
Or you may hit a dead end. For instance, with this submarine off Argentina, I had a hard time because the audience does not seem to care about it. I realize they're taken up with Jack Parr and other anxieties, but I began to think that this submarine, what if the submarine turned out to be ours? Well, I got no laugh, but I finally resolved it last night, as a matter of fact, by saying that it certainly isn't one of ours because our fleet is committed to Trujillo. And
I think it's the pungency of your comments, I think, that to me I feel, give it a lasting quality. I suppose the question often asked you is the nature of heckling. This is every comic as such. I call you a humorist. I think
That's
there's a difference.
All right. I'm not insulted.
No, I think there's a comic artist. W.C. Fields, let's say, is a comic artist.
He sure was.
He's the character, whereas you are the commentator. Am I right in drawing this line?
Yeah, I've never.
Yeah.
I haven't cultivated any skills as a comedian per se at all.
Yet you are acting. I think you are becoming a
yeah,
serious actor.
Yes, more and more. I'm freeing myself a little. The help of Sandy Meisner and a couple of other people.
Oh, you're studying what we call the method, I suppose. A much overused phrase here too.
Not really. We had a meeting out on the coast. The Actors Studio is trying to raise funds, and they recruited me along with some other people to help them. I thought it was a worthy cause. I went to the meeting, and Lee Strasberg cautioned everybody. He said, when soliciting funds, he said, please do not answer anyone who asks you what the method is. He said, you'll alienate them immediately. Not actually, but getting back to what you were saying, I think that, there are hecklers. There aren't many, though. Golly, there aren't many. I bet there haven't been a half a dozen in a year. I think it's essential to point out that a really conservative person does not heckle. What they do, what you get usually is a bigot, the kind of person who says, shut up, even if 400 people want to hear it. Minority rule, which is not foreign matter to a bigot. I would say this, though, about conservatism. You know, I was working on the script of a television show recently, and we were constructing my adversary in the script. I was sitting around with the writers, and we decided he should be everything that I'm not. He's of another generation, and he's an extremely conservative person, and he's not a free thinker, and he's narrow. But I wanted him to have some definition as a character beyond being against the hero, me in this case. I wanted our lack of communication to reside in the fact that I think my way for my time, and he can't understand it, but it's the only way I can live. And conversely, I can't accept him because he has grown up in a tradition of conservatism, and it works for him. That's what he is. And that's the hard part for me to accept, is that it works for him. I don't think it can work for the underlings, but it works for him. And I think that's important.
There's something, I want to come back to something you've said earlier.
Yes.
The cynical approach that is accepted.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're called a cynic, and yet you're not. What I personally like about your approach is that there is affirmation underneath all this.
Well, of course there is. And there's the same way, you know, someone talks about girls. And I talked about girls on Lee Vogel's show recently, you know, the new Shay show. And we talked about women. And you know, the initial reaction is everybody says I'm bitter. Why am I bitter? Because I am inundated by a literal sea of women, and I can't find the one I'm looking for. I hope to, though, or obviously I wouldn't take the trouble. You know, it's like the nihilist who wrote the book. He must have cared about something, or he wouldn't have written the book. A classic collegiate example. Of course, you know, you cannot. My affirmation is implicit. I'm happy to hear you say that, because I was attacked on NBC once by Van Doren, you know, the star of The Price Was Right, who said that I'm against everything. I'm not for anything, and that's why I would never rank with Will Rogers. Well, I don't. All right, so I won't rank with Will Rogers. That's fine. But nevertheless, you know, if you're against, you know, bomb tests, you must be for something. I think that's the legacy of the Eisenhower years. You're against segregation, but you're not necessarily for integration. You're in the middle, the man in the middle. You know, I'd use it, but it's probably a Graham Greene title already.
Since you brought something up here, affirmation, and someone said you're not in the category of Will Rogers. To me, and I don't mean to denigrate the memory of Mr. Rogers, I think the legend should be separated from the fact. Will Rogers never really attacked targets that were, that were not clay pigeons, really. His subjects, as a record, I wish perhaps we could play part of this if Jim could get it here, just as an example. And again, without any purpose of destroying the legend, but I think the fact and the legend should be separated. His subjects were divorce, were prohibition, but he lived in a certain era that was full of a great deal of Twainian Mr. Dooley kind of humor, and yet never once did...
Of course. In other words, when he said the United States is the only country that will go to the poorhouse in a new car or something, it's nice to laugh, but it reminds me of... I don't know what it does socially as far as a corrective condition. It's like the people who say to me, I say, what about the police scandal? And people say, oh, you find that in every era. When people say to me, when they don't lament a condition, in other words, I don't expect them to go out in mobs in the street and riot. I don't want anybody to recall the mayor. But when they state a condition and they don't lament it, they don't exactly rejoice in it, but it's as if they were looking for an affirmation, to use your word again, so that they can exist at that level. It's the same people who, even before the press attacked Castro, they said to me, he's not so perfect. No one is. Because if anyone is, that will raise the level, and I will have to adhere to the new level. It's better to think that everyone is corrupt. It's easier than forcing the issue. That's very unfortunate, because when someone walks up to me and says, as they did last night, it's a dog-eat-dog world, but they said it almost as if, well, now we know the rules, now let's go to work, instead of saying it with some degree of lament. These kind of general arguments, you know, about, in other words, you make a joke about the fact that women are full of vagaries. Well, you know, you should be throwing your hands up or at least be a little frustrated, not just rejoice in it, because that's truly being a spectator.
I don't want to leave this subject yet.
Yeah, go.
Something you just said here about people almost liking, you're hitting, I think, a key here to our malaise. people liking the little corruptions because their own lives then don't have to be altered, or their values, except maybe cockeyed, don't have to be changed.
Remember, people say, well, who do you meet? They're kidding about, I don't meet the cross-section of America. In other words, Mort, you're looking for the perfect woman. Have you looked everywhere? You're really in the nightclub business. And to kid myself, I say, yes, I've looked everywhere from one end of the bar to the other. But the truth is that I do meet more than the people at the bar. I meet all kinds of people. These people go all the way from, as we were talking about, the McCarthyites, all the way through the jaded ex-left wing. As a matter of fact, the man who attacked Castro the most vehemently was not his natural-born enemies, which are the extreme right wing, of course, but a blacklisted writer in Hollywood who was convinced that the world has come to an end. And, I don't know what torture he went through. I can't imagine, because I'm not in his age bracket or his group. But I should think that, there was a time when he would have looked at a guy like Castro as a guiding light. And today he's saying he'll sell out. Everyone does.
So from one form of idealism to extreme cynicism.
Well, sure, it's an unrequited idealism, so it went to cynicism, and boy, cynicism is the word, Studs. It is all about us, except it's mislabeled. When someone says to Eisenhower at this press conference today, what are we going to do about the missile gap with the Russians? He then says, don't be cynical about America. We have to live in the faith that we can triumph. Well, a lot of people forget things about this country. One of the opportunities that's being muffed, I gather, in Washington is that this is probably the only country in history which can straighten itself out, no matter what the calamity, without violent overthrow. We have a very flexible form of government, which was set up by some pretty bright guys, like, I suppose, Jefferson and Paine, that group. There are probably more great men in a more localized area, probably since Greece. That many great men in one area. But I hate to see the opportunity blown, because it's blown for all of us collectively. He's always talking about, we have to have faith, and, which is fine. It's on your postmark and everything, but that doesn't help. There's anyway, the degree of corruption now relates to the word survival. And it isn't a joke anymore. In other words, you can't be a spectator. You can't stand by and make jokes like these kind of jokes that, that stereotype that congressmen talk but don't do anything. Everybody talks as if, well, they'll always do that. What about police corruption? Well, there'll always be corruption. There is no always. And there is no second chance, as Mr. Schulberg said many years ago, in The Disenchanted. Africa asked for a chance and nobody gave it to them, so they're taking it now, from what I read.
So what I suspected, Mort, you are a moralist. You are.
I
mean,
am?
a moralist.
That's the first time I've ever been accused of that.
I was thinking, did you see, this is not unrelated. There was a play by the Swiss writer Dürrenmatt, The Visit. The Visit, seemingly, outwardly a cynical play, yet not. This man who spoke of the ease with which good people are corrupted and live with it. Dürrenmatt is a man of nobility. He really is. He's saying it shouldn't be this way. In the sense what you are saying, if I may draw this conclusion. You are pinpointing some of our ailments and saying it doesn't have to be corrupt. We don't have to kill each other.
When I walk into a social situation and I have to apologize for saying, I really have to defend remarks like, man is a noble animal. When I have to defend that, then where we are. And, people are looking, and I can't find anyone who thinks straight. They talk about, they say, I was at a party Saturday night, a cocktail party. What was the purpose of the party? I don't know. Reminds me of what Herb Schreiner used to say. We held a party to raise funds for liquor for the next party. That's what it sounds like. That's a cocktail party. We're talking about Castro, and people say, he can't push the United States around. See, now they're talking nationalistically. All right, fine. They're going to go to war over what he said about America. And they say, by the way, I feel that if they went to war with Castro, he'll be in an even stronger position. Because if the United States annexed Cuba, Castro could really criticize Eisenhower with impunity because he'd be a Southern governor, right? If I spoke Spanish, I'd tell him that. But that's where the real freedom resides. But here, and they say, they say, he can't say that about us. Then I say something about him. Then they say, well, he expropriated the sugar plantations. Now they're talking in terms of economic determination. Then they say, if he's going to push us around, now they're talking as Americans again, in a patriotic sense, we should apply economic sanctions. Now, that's not very heroic for a person who's really angry about national pride. They're going to apply economic sanctions. So now they're talking that way again. Then, so I said to one of them, well, find out how you're going to go down there. Are you going to go down as a Marine defending the flag, or are you going to go down as an employee of the United Fruit Company? Decide, where your values are. I mean, talk about one thing at a time, but the fact that no one can think on one track, being single-minded isn't so bad. People say it as a kind of a criticism.
So there's certainly a health. There's certainly a health that you exude, and an answer to those who use the word sickness. And I want to ask something. I think this has I hope it has a happy answer. Your most enthusiastic audience, is it among the young, among students? I mean, can you draw a line somewhere here?
Well, I did that concert at Northwestern a couple of weeks ago, and we had 8,000 people who were really listening, but there were a lot of faculty people in the audience, too. And I wouldn't attempt to stratify the audience. I think that it's everywhere. Let's say that the kids have had more exposure. But it's a big kick to go into the Shea, and have people, who are not, quotes, my people, react.
Here's a point. I think you've brought something new up now. You're at the Chez Paris. I think we should make this point clear. Mort Sahl is at the Chez Paris until when?
27th.
Until the 27th. This is a club that, by quote-unquote intellectual, is not considered a center of great stimulation. Now, and I know people in the trade, nightclub editors, have been wondering what the reaction would be of people who have been accustomed to Jerry Lewis and Danny Thomas and Sophie Tucker to your
It goes
humor.
back to the same thing, Studs. They're not given a chance. Now, because of that cultism again. It's like, now last night I was interviewed by a kid who said to me, he has an FM show, and he said to me, well, I didn't think people would understand you here, and all these remarks about the low level of taste, but not as a lament, remember, and not as a complaint, because after all, he's removed from it, So, in other words, people are, according to him, people are ignorant, the norm. He then told me, he mentioned in one breath the recent scandals in Washington with the disc jockeys who were paid to play rock and roll, paid to build a Frankenstein monster. Then he said to me, well, you've got to cater to public taste. They were playing what people want. Well, why were they bribed if people wanted it? Why were they bribed to play certain records? They can't relate it to public taste. In other words, they decide what people want, and then they feed it to them arbitrarily. I decided what I thought they wanted, and my own theorem has always been that people don't want anything. If you're fighting anything, it's apathy. And you can bring them up as well as down. You can do anything you want. I always talk up to them. That's been my approach. And it works. I mean, they seem to be ready, and more than ready. And the critics, it's amazing. I don't look down on the audience, but the critics do, which I think is significant.
Often it's said of your humor, we like Mort Sahl, as they said of a recent candidate for president not too long ago. We like Mort Sahl, but they wouldn't understand him.
Yeah, well, that's that's a typical. I made a virtue out of that. See, instead of a handicap, I've twisted that into a virtue because it gets people in. They think they're the only ones who understand it, but it's unfortunate because if a person is a true believer, they would want to communicate. When I first started following Dave Brubeck, I was an evangelist on his behalf. And when more and more people bought his records, I thought that was a triumph for taste. In this country, it's immediately interpreted that he must have diluted his offering or he wouldn't be popular.
Of course, you find it.
And this is a democracy, let's remember. Let's announce that on the quarter hour.
Particularly in jazz, since you mentioned Brubeck, you find the cultists, those who possess this man and will not allow him outside.
There's a good article in the Downbeat Yearbook. There's if you can wade through it, there's a conversation between Bill Russo and some other people, but Russo makes a cardinal point here, and we should make this clear to the jazzniks, because there's a terrible thing going on in jazz now, which we ought to get into someday, between the Jim Crow people and the Crow Jim people. There's a terrible gulf between the races, but there's a point which Russo makes in there. Now, just as the so-called stand-up Borscht Belt comedians have accused me of being an egghead and not communicating with people, and why don't you entertain people and don't give them messages? This is very interesting. Russo has been accused of formalizing composition and not playing for people. Now, he answered that by saying, instead of justifying himself and saying, yes, I may only fall in the trap, say, I only play to a minority, but they enjoy it. He didn't say that. He said any work of art will communicate to all people. And he pointed out that no one was exposed to Michelangelo, no matter how ignorant, who didn't get something out of it. He said that the real cultists were these so-called commercial people who lay down hard and fast rules and play for one another, but create a climate of social ostracism as a threat so that you are forced to accept what they're doing, which is a hostile message and has very little content. And I believe that to be true. They are the cultists, and they discriminate on the worst basis of all, social ostracism, rather than, status seeking, rather than on a level of content. And he is correct, of course.
And just what Bill Russo has said in Downbeat, you are proving in this vast and this big nightclub shape parade.
I wish
people of all backgrounds, no matter, they need no esoteric training here.
Well, of course, and there's a certain validity to the truth, and believe me, I will discard it soon enough if it doesn't play on the stage. But let the audience be the jury. It's just as arbitrary to have a disc jockey telling people what they can hear, or a jazz critic, as to say that I should, certainly Mr. Halper doesn't ask me to type up my material for this evening and submit it to him. That's the funny part. That's become the freest form. Kenton said to me, I just finished 11 weeks with Stan in California. And Stan said to me, he says, you're doing what the churches should do. He says, you're standing up there and you're preaching, and nightclubs have become the temples. Which is odd enough, isn't it? But if the people come, I would say that qualifies.
Again, this leads us back to the original question as to what is humor, humor as you're practicing it today. That your humor is not new, it's just been discarded, unfortunately, or not been practiced too long.
No, of course not. Americans, people used to think we could laugh at ourselves, but we've gone a long way to disproving that lately.
Touching this point, if you will, this matter of laughing at yourself, well, it's pretty obvious that we've lost a great deal of this capacity in the past 15 years or so.
To laugh at ourselves? Well, the whole image is incorrect. For instance, when we don't admit any mistakes, and when we do admit a mistake, it's admitted in that we have a new stereotype in this country. That kind of ugly American kind of ambassador. He's kind of a fella full of goodwill, but he just can't communicate with people. There's a good collegiate term, communicating. Now, that's a joke you can do for college people, but wouldn't necessarily play too well anywhere else. Eisenhower said, I know more about missiles than anyone alive. So the problem must be that he can't communicate, right? That's it anyway. But here you've got, this idea of the American ambassador is running around, and he's kind of a naive young fellow with a barrel full of money, and he helps everybody, but they don't care about him because foreigners are cynical. That's ridiculous. In other words, it's more than a mistake. There are certain, there are economic royalists in this country who put us in the jackpot we're in, and I don't... I certainly don't go along with that, we tried and where did we go wrong? What is that? I mean, you know where a marriage is going. You don't turn around to a woman after 5 or 10 years and say, what happened to us? What is that? You can tell.
Way back, I was about to start a Will Rogers recording here, if we may. And again, just to hear part of this, I think this deals with the traditional, not humor, traditional joke. Let's hear part of it.
Carry on, Studs.
These talking machines are great things. When you come to a theater or movies to see some of us and you don't like our act, you just kind of out of courtesy, you have to stick and see it through. But on one of these, if you don't like us, you just stop the machine, take the record off, and accidentally drop it on the floor. Then the only annoyance we cause you is sweeping up. Now, folks, all I know is just what little news I read every day in the papers. I see where another wife out on Long Island near New York just shot her husband. Season opened a month earlier this year. Prohibition's caused all this. There's just as many husbands shot at in the old days, but women were missing them. Prohibition's improved their marksmanship 90%. Never a day passes in New York without some innocent bystander being shot. You just stand around this town long enough and be innocent, and somebody's going to shoot you. One day there was 4 shots. That's the best shooting ever done in this town. Hard to find 4 innocent people in New York, even if you don't stop to shoot them.
I think that just gives us an idea.
Now, he is a wholesome commentator in the American scene, and he made great levity out of people shooting one another. Lenny Bruce is supposed to be the dean of the sick comics. 2 weeks ago in Miami, I heard Lenny say A despondent intellectual who thought the world was going to hell is on the ledge of a hotel. And Lenny went on to tell how this is considered prime sick humor today. He was condemned for this, by the way. This guy's on the ledge, and a policeman goes up to talk him out of committing suicide. And since this intellectual is quite a reasonable man and knows that the world is going to hell, he reasons with the policeman, and soon the policeman joins him on the ledge. And soon he has all people out on the ledge, hundreds of them. And he's trying to keep them in line and get them organized and unionized and so forth. So I ask you, there are your values. Sick humor. Joey Bishop and Jan Murray, who are both genuine comedians, wholesome fellows, critics of the new school, used terms like, I hit one of those things in traffic the other day. What is it? A kid. Funny? And as far as that goes, Joey Adams, the president of our union, wrote a book, and he's had a lot to say, I understand, over the years about sick comedians who shouldn't be irreverent about the president and the Pope, as Lenny Bruce was, I gather, in one of his records, and so forth. And yet he entitled his book about comedians, It Takes One to Know One, and the connotation of that title is somewhat suspect. So you see, it's not so exclusive, is it?
Here we come to this an earlier question again of those who are quick to use the phrase sick humor about someone who challenges them, someone who does not conform to the accepted pattern today, and then you wonder about the values of the one who uses the phrase sick humor.
Well, we're becoming a more responsible nation. There are a lot of people today, if you use political material, they say, well, I don't know what you believe in, but you sound a little bit like a little red to me. They'll say that, or a little pink. See, we're more responsible. 10 years ago, they would have said, you are. But today,
Progress.
Today, yes, I think they're becoming more responsible as a group. But boy, it's really kind of amazing. I mean, the fact that in some ways it's amazing that nothing has been done over the years, and in some ways it's amazing that anything has been done. It's a double-edged.
I know it's probably too soon for you to draw conclusions in regard to your audience, the nature.
Oh, sure.
But I was thinking, coming back again, you were at Northwestern last Saturday night. You said there were 6,000 students. 8,000
students. Yes,
and
sir.
I know that you're very popular in many quarters, but especially on the campuses of the country. Do you feel, I don't mean it to be a leading question.
No.
Do you feel there's a note of hope in this?
Oh, sure I do. I say it to the kids, too. I think it's essential that they have concern. They care about the world they're in. They think it's worth saving. And they're not being fed much, I mean, don't forget that it's true that they're kind of apathetic, but they're not being given much. I mean, what are they asked to do? For instance, they're asked to go in the Army when most people aren't going. It's not a general condition. It's not a rah-rah situation. And most of all, they don't have leadership. We had a thing, When we went to war, even though I didn't know the values, if I were young, when I first time I went in the Army, I was 15, but I looked around and I saw, here was Roosevelt. And I thought to myself, if the old man is angry about this, there must be something to it. They don't have that. Like leadership, it's a kind of a cliche, but there it is.
Someone would even say passion. Passion is missing, perhaps.
Well,
the blandness.
course.
It's called
Of
the bland
course.
generation.
Well, it is. I mean, but, where are they going to... The thing I try to say to all of them is, be your own man. That's what dissent means. Hang on to yourself. Don't give it away. Don't give it away to become, a pre-med or to get married or to justify yourself to your parents. Or, in other words, the norm isn't worth joining. That's what I try to tell them. In other words, don't, put your chin up and they say, I bet you don't approve of fraternities, Mr. Sahl. They almost always say that to me wherever I go. Well, don't, say, I took a stand. It's going to be hard and I'm going to be lonely, during rush week, but I'm not going to join because they discriminate. Don't do that. Just reason about it. Say, it's very dull, and if I want to eat with somebody, I'll choose them on another basis other than Greek letters. And that it's boring. And if it isn't boring, join it. But, I mean, I try to get to them, I try to get to them in a very primitive, a prime sense, not on a high level of principles. In other words, that it is stupid to stay up all night and drive 600 miles to go to the game in another city. What is it worth? And if it is worth something, okay. I don't mind if their drives are even carnal as long as they have some.
Mort
It shouldn't be derivative.
You've just given us the core, I think, of your approach. The phrase you used, be your own man. I think this, to me, as we've been talking here, in a land of the rugged individual, you're saying be your own man, so I can't think of a humor that is more native than yours. And I'm happy to hear you say that you are affirmative. I suspected this. You are, of course.
Listen, I'm, very happy to talk about the things I am affirmative about. But, it's interesting how you get, I was talking about sports cars on the stage one night, which are one of the things I'm affirmative about, prime values. But little things come up which may sound negative, but they're just revealing. I was pointing out what a car means to a man. Now, this is where you get to an area where a joke really hits, but there's no reaction. Because this is an anti-male joke, I'm going to tell. And the men think you've betrayed them, and the women hate a man who's perceptive. They really do, because that's their province, you're putting them out of work.
You're anti-woman.
It never occurs to them, I stole all the lines from a woman anyway, but that's all right. It's like, so you have nobody. That leaves nobody. It has to do with, I was waxing on about sports cars. I never did get to the joke, because this occurred to me. The guy's talking about the suspension and the response of the steering and the acceleration and all the values of driving a car like that really responds on the road. And after he gives it all in detail, he says, how else are you going to get sexual satisfaction? Which is very accurate.
Mort Sahl, humorist. I think that's the most apt phrase to use. And now at the Chez Paris until March 27th.
February 27th.
I'm sorry.
So that's right.
I wishful thinking on my part, I'm sure. I
month
said
is
March
as good
27th.
as the other.
February 27th. And again, if I may return to the phrase to describe what is to me Mort Sahl's humor, be your own man. On that note, Mort, thank you for letting us have your thoughts, and thank you for speaking your thoughts where you do.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Studs. Back in the city again.
Thanks a lot.